All right, so our next piece is to talk about something called the amplitude. So this is my function, f of x is equal to sine of x. We're talking about the amplitude of this function. I'm going to draw a sketch of the graph. Here's -1 and 1. So let's see, 1, 2, 3, there's pi. That looks to be about 2 pi, 3 pi, negative pi, and so on. So we have pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, 5 pi over 2, and so on. Negative pi over 2, negative 3 pi over 2. And so then the graph sign starts at, let's mark in all these basic points, 0, 1, 0, negative 1, 0, 1, 0. This cycle continues. Negative 1, 0, positive 1, 0, and so on. And so the graph continues in that direction, and it continues in the negative direction, something like that. So that's a reasonable approximation of the graph. Now, the graph has three pieces. We have the peaks, we have a peak, we have a trough, and we have the axis. All right? The peak, as you might expect, is sort of self-describing. It's the highest point on the graph. So in this case, negative 3 pi over 2 comma 1. This is the peak. The next peak appears here. The next peak appears here. Those are simply the highest points on the graph. The top of the hill, if you will. All right? Then the trough represents the bottom point, the lowest point on the graph. In this case, that's at negative pi over 2 comma negative 1. The next low point would be here, right, occurring at 3 pi over 2. And then if we connect the peaks together, we get what's called, if we consider the line that passes through all those peaks, that's called the peak line. The line that passes through the peaks is the peak line. And then similarly, if we draw a line that passes through all the troughs, is it clear there would be an infinite string of them going out in both directions? That would be the trough line. And then the axis of the curve is the line that is midway between the peaks and the troughs. So in this particular case, the axis of the curve is the x-axis. That is not necessarily always the case. So what we do have is another piece of terminology. The points where the curve intersects the axis. Each of those points is called a node. So each of these points is a node. The point where the curve itself intersects the axis is called the nodes. So we have the peaks, the peak line. We have the troughs, the trough line. We have the axis, right? The axis is this line that passes through midway between the peaks and the troughs. And then wherever the curve itself intersects the axis, those are called the nodes.